It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show here on WHP 580 iHeartRadio and News Talk 104.1 FM and 1600 AM at WEJS. And we're happy to have you here on the show today. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And by the way, if you'd like to watch prior podcasts of the show or take a look at some great merchandise we have, including our popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt and the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard signs and T-shirts, go to the MarkScaringiShow.com website. And for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.
And so let's get right to it today. There's been a lot that has been happening around the country in the news as the country continues to deal with the rioting and the looting and the vandalism in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We also had the death of Rayshard Brooks in Fulton County, Georgia, and Atlanta. That has also sparked riots, looting, and vandalism. And it seems like this George Floyd death has done a lot, really, to kind of fan the flames, so to speak, of lots of liberal activist groups and organizations around the country who are using the tragic death of George Floyd to promote their political views and to push their political views on the rest of America. So we're witnessing liberal activists from around the country having a renewed energy, if you will, in pushing even harder to remove statues, monuments, and memorials to some of the greatest men in the history of our country. Now, what this has to do with the death of George Floyd is, of course, nothing. It's completely unrelated and irrelevant, yet these liberal activist organizations will use the tragic death of George Floyd as a justification to tear down monuments to some of the greatest men in American history. So we have liberal activists are denouncing these men as racists and colonizers and not worthy of admiration or distinction. In some cases, activists are working within the system to have boards, commissions, and even municipal city and state governments remove these monuments, and others are taking matters and the law into their own hands. And I shouldn't have to point out, but I will, it is a crime to remove statues without authorization. And of course, it's a crime to vandalize them. But that's not stopping many of these liberal activists from taking this criminal action. Now, on June 14th, so just a little over a week or two ago, in Portland, Oregon, a group of about 15 people, they used ropes and an axe to topple a statue of Thomas Jefferson that stood on the front steps of the appropriately named Jefferson High School in North Portland. Now, one of the men who toppled the statue was interviewed by the local media, and I thought the interview and his responses to be of interest. He said he was not concerned about being arrested because the reporter asked him if he was worried about the criminal nature of what he did and possibly being arrested. He said, no, he's not concerned about being arrested because he's white, which I'm not sure that has anything to do with the fact that he will likely not be arrested. I think the fact that he will likely not be arrested is because the city government supports his act to tear down and desecrate the statue of Thomas Jefferson. And the vandal, if you will, went on and said, it just felt it was the moment. Like everyone was there together. It was a joyous moment. That's his explanation for why he joined the group of others who had ropes and were pulling down the statue of Thomas Jefferson. So here's a man who lives in the moment. Notice there was no reason, no rationality, no critical thinking in his explanation for why he toppled and desecrated a statue of Thomas Jefferson. He was just living in the moment and committing a criminal act in the moment. That's his explanation. And then he went on to explain that the Thomas Jefferson statue should not have been placed there in the first place because it is a predominantly African American school. And I might point out in response to this white liberal vandal that, it's not an African American school. It has nothing to do with Africa, nor do those who attend it. It's an American school. And the boys and girls who attend it are American. They're not African. And we really shouldn't refer to them as African American. They're American. They're as red, white, and blue as that white liberal vandal and as every one of us. The black boys and girls who attend that school are American, and they're American to the core. Yet this white liberal vandal thought that Thomas Jefferson, was an affront to the black schoolboys and girls, as if Jefferson is an enemy of black Americans. And I think that's so untrue and so regrettable. Thomas Jefferson is one of our most important founding fathers who, with his pen, gave birth to this nation in 1776, and he led our nation as its third president. He was one of the most brilliant Americans to have ever lived, and his writings have served as a clarion call for freedom and equality in America and around the world. And obviously, we didn't have racial equality in the 1780s and 1790s and throughout most of the 19th century. But later politicians, including Abraham Lincoln, would use the ideals and the beautiful phrasing and writings of Thomas Jefferson to advance his earlier call for equality to all Americans, including black Americans. I think it's beautiful what later politicians and statesmen did with the ideals and the writings postulated by Thomas Jefferson. Yet, because Jefferson, like many Southern whites of his day, owned slaves, this white liberal vandal in Portland, Oregon, of a week or two ago, decided that the very image of Jefferson was an insult to the young black boys and girls who attend Jefferson High School. And never mind that Jefferson advocated for the liberalization of Virginia's penal code, for religious tolerance, wrote the Declaration of Independence, was elected governor of Virginia, served as Secretary of State, as president for 2 terms, founded the Library of Congress, founded the University of Virginia, among many other significant historical accomplishments. Jefferson should be a model for schoolboys and girls of all races to emulate across our country and the world over. Yet now he's portrayed as a villain. And the irony is Jefferson, up until a few years ago, was often claimed by our liberal friends as their own. Liberals historically championed Jefferson as the father of liberalism in America. But that was then, and this is now. And his statue in Portland, Oregon, was toppled and desecrated. And that's, I think, a blemish on America and a stain on America. And it's regrettable that it's happened but there's a lot more to come, I'm afraid. We're going to talk more about the toppling of the great statues and monuments and memorials of America and other important legal and political issues when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're certainly talking about America first today. We're talking about this movement among liberal activists across the country, stemming in part as a result of the tragic death of George Floyd, where we have liberal organizations, individuals, mobs, in some cases, taking down, toppling, removing statues, desecrating, vandalizing statues of great Americans across the country. We've talked about the taking down of the statue of Thomas Jefferson that stood out front of Jefferson High School in Portland, Oregon, and the reasoning and rationale that was put forth by the young man who was involved in toppling the Jefferson statue. He said it was in the moment. It felt like, it felt good. It felt like the right thing to do. He doesn't believe he's going to be arrested or prosecuted for the criminal act because he is white, according to him. And he did it because he didn't think that the black school boys and girls of Jefferson High School should have to look at a statue of Thomas Jefferson. Apparently, these white liberal activists, vandals in this particular case, believe that Thomas Jefferson, constitutes an affront to black schoolboys and girls across the country. So the statues of Thomas Jefferson must come down. The Thomas Jefferson as a name to the schools, I would assume, must now be removed because I guess it's hurtful or hateful, according to the liberals who are agitating for this and just taking the law into their own hands and doing it. It's hateful and hurtful to black schoolboys and girls to look at a statue of Thomas Jefferson. So 4 nights later, several dozen people tore down a statue of George Washington, wrapped it in an American flag, and set the flag on fire. Now, the district attorney in Portland announced he will not be pressing charges on those individuals who committed the crime of toppling the statue of George Washington and desecrating it. And across the country, a statue memorial to George Washington in Baltimore was vandalized with red paint. The memorial sits in Druid Hill Park in northwest Baltimore. It also now has the words "Destroy Racists" inscribed on the statue, and the initials for the Black Lives Matter movement written on the base of the statue of George Washington in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, needless to say, George Washington is the father of our country. He's our greatest American, yet liberals today view Washington as a racist and someone un-American because they want to erase him from American life and American history. You know, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and our founding fathers, they define America. You know, they are America. Why? Well, they created it. It's their project. They established our nation, wrote its laws, created its institutions, and set America on its way. We have inherited the great nation that they built and maintained. We're its beneficiaries. We're the beneficiaries of their great and heroic work. They established our nation, To deface or topple statues of Washington and Jefferson is to deface and topple America. Remember, unlike most countries around the world, which were founded, built, and sustained by race and ethnicity, by the race and ethnicity of those who comprise those countries, America was different. America was founded upon an idea, not a race or an ethnicity. And these great men, Washington, Jefferson, they embody the idea of America, not the race of any of its constituent parts. And toppling statues of a nation's statesmen, well, that's what conquering armies do. Recall Soviet and American soldiers destroying the symbols of the Nazi Party and Nazi leaders when they conquered Germany. No foreign army, well, with the exception of the British Army in 1812, has ever been able to topple or desecrate the symbols of America. Yet our own American citizens are doing it for them. They're doing what our enemies have not been able to do for themselves. This same man who was involved in toppling the statue of Thomas Jefferson in Portland, Oregon, he was asked about Mount Rushmore, if Mount Rushmore should be scrapped. His response, Mount Rushmore is another travesty itself. It doesn't matter that they carved into those mountains. It's still a shitty thing they've done. They will forever be desecrated. Now, on Mount Rushmore is not only Washington and Jefferson, but Theodore Roosevelt and the great emancipator himself, Abraham Lincoln. So this liberal vandal believes that Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves, should be removed from Mount Rushmore. Why? Possibly as a way for white America to atone for its slavery past. I assume that's what this man is reasoning. Those are the reasons behind this man's comment that we should tear down Mount Rushmore now. Now, removing or destroying the monuments to our founding fathers, is the destruction of America. That our governments are complicit or leading this effort in some cases reveals that, I think, regrettably, these liberal vandals will win. They already hold positions of great power in our governments, in many of our government positions, as well as they occupy the streets of many of our major cities, no doubt, and they just take the law into their own hands and they just remove the statues themselves. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, well, he announced that New York City would establish a city commission for racial justice and reconciliation, just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, he said. He appointed his wife, who's a Marxist, to lead the commission. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, remember, was established after the end of apartheid in 1994 to investigate human rights abuses by both sides in the decades-long conflict between the white minority government and the black liberation movement, the black majority in South Africa. So one I think one can easily conclude that the de Blasio Racial Justice and Reconciliation Committee, it's going to examine New York City's history of white racism against blacks and will make more recommendations to remove statues and memorials to white men whom the commission deems to be racist and unworthy of commemoration. Now, slavery ended in America a long, long time ago. In 1865, when Union troops finally brought the southern states and the southern armies to their knees. We ended slavery, abolished slavery many, many, many years ago. We fought against, we did have Jim Crow and we did have segregation, no question about that. And that was a horrible period in the history of our country. Yet those laws have been struck down. That system has been removed. many, many, many decades ago. Yet now, apparently, we need a racial justice and reconciliation commission. It seems to be a little bit ahistorical. It's much too late. We're far beyond the time for a racial justice and reconciliation commission. Is the point that I'm trying to make? America has, to a large degree, healed its racial wounds a long time ago, and the great majority of Americans moved beyond the racism and segregation that regrettably was a part of too much of America in our past, and we've moved beyond it. Yet it seems like our government leaders are pulling us back. They want us to go back and examine the history of racism in America. And for what purpose? For what good will result? I don't think any good will come of any racial justice and reconciliation commission in New York City or in any city across the country. We're going to talk more about the results of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, how it's kind of promoting and pushing a movement by liberal activists to topple and desecrate statues of some of America's greatest statesmen and founders. When we return from this brief commercial break.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about the riots and the looting and vandalism and the desecration of some of America's great statues of some of our greatest statesmen that has resulted from the shooting. I'm sorry, not from the shooting death, but from the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and how regrettably liberal activists, agitators, vandals, if you will, are taking the law into their own hands and vandalizing, desecrating, toppling statues of some of America's greatest men of history that we really should be emulating instead of tearing down. Now, for the past week, police officers have been guarding the statue of Theodore Roosevelt that graces the entrance to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City after a group called Decolonize This Place has threatened to remove it. The statue had already been vandalized with paint, and after that incident, the museum didn't respond to several requests for comment about whether it believed the vandal should be prosecuted. And my guess is the vandal will not be arrested, will not be prosecuted, because it's very likely the museum trustees and the city government agree with and support the politics of the vandals. Now, the group Decolonize This Place is likely the group that was involved in vandalizing the statue of Theodore Roosevelt. Apparently, they believe Roosevelt was a colonizer of other countries, and for that reason, they want to remove his statue from the front of the American Museum of Natural History there in New York. Now, the museum itself announced Sunday, lo and behold, that it will remove the statue of Roosevelt from outside its entrance. Now, this bronze statue, which has stood outside of the museum entrance since 1940, depicts Roosevelt riding horseback accompanied by a Native American and an African American male. And somehow, the fact that he's accompanied by a Native American and an African American is somehow racist. I don't know how or why it would be portrayed, or I'm sorry, not portrayed, but perceived to be racist. Is it because the Native American and the African American male are not also on horses? Do they Do they all have to be on horses? And if one is not, that the one who's not is somehow inferior to the one who is on horseback? I mean, it's kind of nutty to try to figure out what is racist about the statue of Theodore Roosevelt. But nevertheless, the museum is taking it down. The museum's president, Ellen Futter, told the New York Times, over the last few weeks, our museum community has been profoundly moved by the ever-widening movement for racial justice that has emerged after the killing of George Floyd. We have watched as the attention of the world and the country has increasingly turned to statues as powerful and hurtful symbols of systemic racism. Wow. First of all, when any commission or board starts talking about racial justice, that should send chills down the spine of any American. That's a very scary phrase, racial justice, because in too many cases, historically around the world, racial justice leads to killings and genocide based upon race. So that is a bad sign to see that term being used now in America. Now, I never knew Theodore Roosevelt was a racist. Now, I've always been a great admirer of Roosevelt. He had an amazing intellect, energy, bravery. He espoused the old daring do, going out to the West, starting a cattle ranch when he was a wealthy New York City slicker, and the Rough Rider experience where he led the Rough Riders in San Juan. Just amazing accomplishments that this man has made. Just an amazing life story. And a big part of the story and the history of our country, when visiting New York City, I take my children to the Museum of Natural History. We look at the Theodore Roosevelt statue, and I talk about Roosevelt's great accomplishments, his personal accomplishments, and also his accomplishments for our country. We go to his home in Gramercy Park. It's still there. His boyhood home is still there, and you can take tours of it, and you can see what a precocious young man he was. He was a sickly child. He built himself into a muscle-bound, strong man in an effort to overcome his childhood asthma. He studied hard. He was an exceptional student. He was a naturalist from his early childhood to the end of his life. His bug collection, by the way, collection, which would far surpass anything the good students of the Camp Hill School District have ever assembled, is still on display in Gramercy Park at his boyhood home. So you can look at his bug collection and be impressed with this man's energy and his mind, his intellect. He was one of America's greatest statesmen. He was one of our first and greatest conservationists. He won the Nobel Prize for Peace for a reason, unlike Barack Obama. Yet apparently now he's a racist and must be removed from American history. 3 or 4 years ago, you may recall the movement to remove the statues and monuments of Confederate war heroes and how that picked up considerable steam. The attempt to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee in a park in Richmond, well, that touched off riots and led to one of the most controversial moments of the Trump presidency, when the president was trying to defend those good people, not the white supremacists or the KKK, the good people who were protesting in opposition to the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue. And Trump famously tweeted, you can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington? Jefferson? So foolish. Well, that was a tweet by President Trump. And many in the media and even in the conservative establishment, they laughed him off, basically saying that no one's going to go after Washington and Jefferson. Well, they have, and Trump was right. Liberal vandals didn't stop at Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, or Stonewall Jackson, or other Confederate leaders. They came right at the heart of America. They're now attacking the father of our country, George Washington, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Oh, and by the way, they're also attacking the man who discovered America, Christopher Columbus. We're going to talk more about these attacks on the statues, monuments, and memorials of some of America's greatest men. When we return from this brief commercial break, you're listening to the Mark
Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 and WEJS out of Williamsport. So we've got Williamsport and Harrisburg represented, and we're also on the iHeartRadio app, so you can download the app on your smartphone and listen to us from anywhere in the world, literally. And we're talking about the unfortunate consequence of the tragic death of George Floyd, in that it has spawned and instigated liberal organizations or just liberal activists and individuals to go after the statues, monuments, and memorials of some of America's greatest men. Now, this has been going on for several years in our country. You'll recall the famous or infamous situation in Richmond, Virginia, of a few years ago that President Trump spoke about. And he spoke in a way that did not satisfy those on the left. I think he only condemned white supremacy and the Klan about 5 times in his statement, but that was not enough for the media and the white liberal establishment. That was regarding the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee in a park in Charlottesville, Virginia. I think I said Richmond, Virginia earlier, but no, it was Charlottesville, Virginia, where that occurred. And Trump then tweeted, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and he even said that during his press conference. Who's next? George Washington? Or are we going to tear down the Washington Monument? Well, it turns out he was correct. He was prescient several years ago. He read it right. And liberal activists, agitators, vandals across the country are starting to tear down statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And now we have the Museum of American History in New York City, one of the oldest and most prestigious institutions in the country, declaring they're taking down that wonderful statue of Theodore Roosevelt that graces the entrance of that beautiful museum, which is right on Central Park West there in the Upper West Side of New York City. Apparently, Theodore Roosevelt, too, was a racist. I never knew that, but I guess he's a racist because of his policies towards Central or South American countries when he was president. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's not very well articulated by the vandals and rioters and looters who have already desecrated that beautiful statue to Theodore Roosevelt. The decolonize group is what they're called. And decolonize this place is what that group is called. And now they're, of course, back to Christopher Columbus, the discoverer the discoverer of America. Protesters in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Virginia have targeted statues of Christopher Columbus, damaging or pulling down 3 of them in a matter of just a few days. A couple of days ago in St. Paul, demonstrators toppled a 10-foot tall statue that stood in front of the Minnesota State Capitol. In Richmond, protesters pulled down an 8-foot tall statue in Byrd Park, carrying it about 200 yards before setting it on fire and throwing it into a nearby lake called Fountain Lake. And around 12:30 a.m. Wednesday, police in Boston received a report that a marble statue of the Italian explorer and colonizer had lost its head. Boston Mayor Marty Walsh told reporters, given the conversations that we are certainly having right now in our city of Boston and throughout the country, we're also going to take time to assess the historic meaning of the statue. Well, that means the Boston mayor will not restore the head of Christopher Columbus and will likely remove the statue altogether. Rest assured, mark my words, I will call that one. So Christopher Columbus statue in Boston, Massachusetts, beheaded. And the mayor of Boston is unlikely to restore the head to the body of the man who discovered America and will likely remove the statue altogether. And will likely make some comments about Columbus being a racist. Now, in St. Paul, where protesters tore Columbus's likeness down to the sounds of singing, drumming, and joyous chants, as Jesse Van Berkel writes for the Star Tribune, police informed the American Indian Movement activist Mike Forcia that he would be charged with criminal damage to property. So in St. Paul, it's the American Indian Movement, which is apparently some sort of grassroots organization of American Indians. They were behind the desecration of the Christopher Columbus statue there, and apparently they are threatening to charge that American Indian with the crime involved in the desecration of that statue. Again, my guess here is he will not be charged. I will be surprised very much if he is. I just don't think that's going to happen because it's very likely that the mayor of St. Paul and obviously certainly the governor of Minnesota likely agree with the American Indian Movement and likely agree with their goal of removing statues of Christopher Columbus and other great men of history who they believe to be racist. So where will this all end? I'm not sure, but I do know it's a radical and fundamental transformation of America. It's the destruction of the history and legacy of the great men who discovered, founded, built, maintained, and defended America. Academia has been calling for this for over a generation now. You've got 2 generations. You've got millions of Americans schooled in this liberal philosophy of victimization and racial retribution and racial vengeance. They now hold power in the major institutions of America. So we are in the process of defacing and defiling our own history. And this likely is the beginning of the end of America as it was founded and as it was intended and as we have known it. We are quickly being ushered into the brave new world in which left-wing extremists are remaking America in their own image. And yes, we do have a champion in President Trump. He has fought back against this movement. But the movement seems to be greater than that particular man. I think we have experienced a cultural revolution in our country. We have seen similar cultural revolutions sweep through countries and destroy and eliminate the traditions and history and legacy of what they believe to be the immoral and impure past, from the Jacobins in the French Revolution to the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution to the Maoists in the Chinese Cultural Revolution and in so many others. Liberal extremist agitators, revolutionaries, if you will. They ride the waves of this cultural revolution that they have created in academia and in the media and in so many of our other institutions. And they ride this wave all the way to the end, and it sweeps away our tradition, our history, our culture. It sweeps away anything that stands in their way of their vision for this new world order. And that's where we are in America today. It's a bleak forecast for what is to come. And sorry to leave you on that downer of a note, but those are just my thoughts on where America is headed. And that's about all the time we have today for the Mark Scaringi Show. I want to thank you for listening and tuning in every Saturday at 1 o'clock on WHP 580 and WEJS 104.1 and 1600. And thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.